On the 24th of September 2022, a 10-year-old boy was found lying at the base of a cliff in Ovingdean, a village near Brighton in the UK. He'd fallen approximately 100 feet onto a concrete path, but by some miracle survived, although with serious and life-changing injuries. Police began investigating what they thought was an accident, and this included talking to a man at the scene called Anthony Stocks, who the boy had last been seen with, who claimed that he'd gotten too close to the edge and fallen. However, detectives soon uncovered the horrific truth. This was no accident. The boy had been pushed in an effort to silence him, as he found out that Stocks had been raping his older sister for years, beginning when she was around 10 years old. Stocks denied his offences, and in court, showing the evil sick man that he is, tried to claim that he was the one who'd been sexually abused by his child victim. Welcome to Evil Among Us. To begin with, I need to state that this video is less rich in details than usual, and that's because few have been reported about either the perpetrator in this case or the victims. Me being me, I've read as much as I can from many different sources to give you as full an account of this disturbing case as possible. With regards to the two child victims, their names and details have been withheld due to their ages, but also to allow them to be anonymous and heal from their trauma, which is totally understandable. I will however give them names to enable their story to be told, so I'll call the male victim Adam and his sister Laura. Turning to Anthony Stocks, all that's been reported is that he was born in either 1970 or 1971 in Peterborough, a city in East England within the county of Cambridgeshire. It was referenced in court that he was raised in an abusive household and has an IQ of 54, which means that he's classified as having a learning disability, and his intellect is within the lowest 1% of the population. However, as I'll circle back to later, I think that IQ is a really poor measure of how dangerous an individual can be, and I disagree with how it's used in courts to automatically reduce sentences related to the most horrific offences. He also had a criminal record, but this was for theft in his youth, and he'd been off the police's radar for decades when he committed these crimes. Anthony Stocks worked as a film extra and appeared in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, released in 2016, and Solo, a Star Wars story, released in 2018. I checked on IMDb to see if I could find any reference to who he might have played in either film, but there was no creepy bastard in the list of characters in either film, so I drew a blank. I joke, of course. Clearly he was just some random background actor in one of the scenes. It seems these were the only films he appeared in, and in court, aside from this glittering career in Hollywood, Anthony Stocks is reported to have never had a job. He was married twice, but in court he claimed he couldn't remember the name of his first wife, which is really odd, but I think part of his strategy to appear harmless. By 2017, Stocks was living in Oxfordshire and was spending much of his time on the internet. The police were able to determine that he spent much of his time looking at pornography. None of it illegal, but there was a general theme where he'd watch videos of older men having sex with much younger women. As I've stated in previous videos, there's usually a progression in the behaviour of those who eventually go on to download child abuse images. They're often initially drawn to legal pornography, but which hints at illegal sexual acts. For example, in the case of Stocks, I'd be shocked if he was not watching pornography where the female actresses were dressed or acted in a way that was meant to imply that they were children. For example, being dressed like a schoolgirl, etc. This is the porn industry's way of making as much money as possible by pandering to the sickest people in society, but ensuring they don't fall foul of the law. This included Anthony Stocks. Whilst he didn't progress to downloading this type of material, it's clear it enabled him to indulge his disgusting proclivities, which revolved around fantasizing about having sex with children. Around this same time, Stocks became friends with a family who had 2 children. How he came to meet them is unclear, but I have no doubt this wasn't by chance. Stocks was looking for opportunities to get his sexual needs met, and he was fully willing to kill in order to achieve this. As I stated, there's not much information about these children, but what we do know paints a picture which points to exactly why they were targeted and how Anthony Stocks was able to get away with his crimes for so long. Laura and Adam were siblings, living somewhere in Oxfordshire. There was 3 years between them, with Laura being the older child. You will, I guarantee, be be thinking to yourself during this video, where were their parents? And that's a really good question. It appears that both parents were far too busy fighting between themselves to look after their children. In court, it was stated that both Laura and Adam had had traumatic childhoods, and I imagine this included being exposed to violence. There were also clearly issues of neglect. Laura later stated that she didn't go to school, and I think a lot can be read into this. Going to school is mandatory, of course, but most parents want to send their children to their classes because they want them to be educated, to gain qualifications, to have a career and be successful in their life. If a parent doesn't bother to make sure their child goes to school, in my opinion anyway, this shows they don't care about the child's future. It's a sign of deeper issues. In my experience, parents who fail in this basic task are also generally disinterested in the child and also fail to meet their other needs, chief amongst them, giving them a sense of security and love. So you have a little girl who was at home all day and whose parents likely didn't care what she was doing from one moment to another, and who was likely desperate for love, attention, affection, for someone to bother with her. This is the perfect environment for a paedophile. As you'll see, Anthony Stocks is an extremely dangerous predator, and I have no doubt that he specifically targeted this family for the reasons I've just mentioned. The grooming of Laura began almost immediately, and it was stated in court that it resulted in her being, quote, dependent on him. This inevitably involved buying her gifts, things she likely wasn't given by her parents, but the main focus was on paying her attention, making her feel loved, all so that he could abuse her and ensure her silence. The sexual abuse began in 2019 when Laura was around 10 years old, beginning with Stocks sexually touching her and then forcing Laura to perform sex acts on him, including touching his penis. Soon after this, Stocks began raping this little girl, and this happened repeatedly. He was jobless and she didn't go to school, so he had access to her constantly. The offending would happen both in the house and outdoors, with Stocks pretending to take Laura to the playground at the park, but then taking her behind a bush to abuse her. He would also sexually assault her behind garages. Laura later stated in court that whilst being raped by this monster, he would say, quote, I love you. This type of manipulation is so destructive and so heinous, as it will likely taint Laura's ability to fully trust people again and impact her relationships in the future. When someone tells them they love her, she will inevitably remember what the first man who told her that did to her. However, Stocks went further. He told Laura that he loved her so much he wanted to marry her one day. This played on this little girl's loneliness and naivety, playing on the idea that many girls have, that when you get married, you're never alone and are always happy. You live happily ever after. As if these statements were not disgusting enough, as we'll get to, there appears to be some indicators that Anthony Stocks actually believed this was a possibility. He was 49 years old when he began molesting Laura, and she was just 10. Laura endured the abuse in silence and alone for 3 years. She said in court that she was afraid of Stocks, so I believe that him threatening to harm her or her brother was likely part of the psychological manipulation of this child. However, eventually, Laura couldn't deal with the burden alone and spoke to the only person in her life who appears to have truly loved her and cared about her, her brother Adam. He was just 7 when the abuse started, and she told him in 2022 when he was 10 years old. When asked why she told her brother, Laura said in court, quote, so he would help me. Adam clearly has the spirit of a warrior. This little boy took it upon himself to protect his sister. He would make sure that he was present whenever Stocks was around Laura, and Adam saw him molesting his sister up close. Giving evidence later, Adam explained when his sister told him what was going on and what he saw, quote, every time my sister went somewhere, he would follow. Then she told me that he asked her to have sex with him. It was happening pretty much every day. I felt very sad for her. I didn't know what to do all the time. I don't think he knew that I knew everything, but he was disappointed, and he kept sighing every time I was there, because nothing would happen. I would see them kissing and everything. It was a habit. I would say, why did you kiss? And he said, I didn't. I couldn't hear her, so I was getting closer. I felt really sad for her. She wouldn't listen, and I was really uncomfortable, and she was really sad. Adam quickly became an annoyance to Anthony Stocks. He stood in the way of him raping Laura, and so he began to plot Adam's murder, to remove him from the picture. Evidence was found by police during their investigation that Anthony Stocks had been researching locations where he could kill Adam. He quickly focused on ending his life by pushing him from a height, something he knew he could potentially get away with by claiming it was an accident. Weeks before the actual attempt, Stocks took Adam to a quarry in Oxfordshire that he'd researched. When he got there, he didn't go through with his plan. Why is unclear, but he likely believed, given the landscape, that his story wouldn't be believed. However, by the middle of September 2022, he'd picked a new location, the cliffs in the village of Ovingdean, which is near Brighton on the south coast. The sick monster told Laura about his plans a few days before the attack, telling her, quote, "I'm going to push him off a cliff. I want to get rid of him so we can be together." Anthony Stocks told Adam they were going on a trip to London to see Stamford Bridge, the home ground of Chelsea Football Club, a team that Adam was mad about. Laura tried to warn her brother, later stating, quote, "I told him not to go to London because I knew he was going to push him off a cliff." But Adam said, "No, I want to go to London." On Saturday, September the 24th, 2022, Anthony Stocks and Adam travelled to Stamford Bridge, West London, and after looking around the ground, he suggested, as it was a nice day, they go to the seaside. They then got on a train and travelled to Brighton before taking a taxi to Ovingdean, arriving there at 3:32 p.m. This trip would have taken at least 2 hours, 120 minutes, for Stocks to reconsider his plan, to stop what he was about to do, but I'm sure this never entered his mind. This timescale also shows this was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was a premeditated plan to take the life of a 10-year-old little boy. When they got to Ovingdean, they travelled to the cliffs. There were several people who saw the pair. One witness, when asked to describe the pair in court, said, quote, "One was a little boy and the other was an older chap. The boy looked quite exuberant. He looked like an average boy doing average boy things. The other man was walking several paces behind, walking very quickly, as if to keep up with the boy. He just seemed quite determined and not very happy. He didn't seem like a happy chappy. I only saw him for a couple of seconds. He seemed like someone out for a walk, but was not in a good mood." This man and his wife then travelled down to the beach and were sitting some distance away and looked up at the cliff tops. To their horror, they saw two figures standing at the very edge of the cliff, meaning that they climbed over fencing that had been installed to protect members of the public from falling. Then, whilst watching, the man said, quote, "I almost saw something. I can't quite describe what it was. An object. Something fell, and then I looked away. I remember hearing a shriek. It was very, very audible." What he'd witnessed was Anthony Stocks trying to kill Adam. Stocks had coaxed the boy towards the cliff edge, and whilst he was looking down over the sheer drop, had stood behind him and pushed him, sending Adam plummeting 100 feet to the concrete floor below. The man and his wife then walked towards the cliffs and were horrified to see a crowd of people stood around the body of a severely injured and unconscious little boy. He continued, quote, "We bumped into several people, but one I believe was the man we saw earlier. I told him, 'Don't go that way, there's been an accident,' and he said, 'I know.'" Another witness had an even more horrific experience as they were walking along the path at the bottom of the cliff and saw Adam hit the ground right in front of them. Despite landing on concrete, by some miracle, Adam was alive but severely injured. He had several deep lacerations to his scalp, abrasions to his chest, multiple bruises, multiple fractures to his left arm, and a deformity to his left shoulder. Within minutes, 3 ambulances and the police were on the scene, and an air ambulance was soon dispatched when the severity of Adam's injuries became clear. Anthony Stocks had calmly walked down the cliff and joined the concerned crowd of people who were standing around Adam. However, his behaviour was very strange, and this was noticed immediately. He seemed more concerned about giving his account of what had happened rather than rushing to the side of this injured child. This was clearly because he was seething that Adam had, despite his best efforts, survived. I was worried that he would be caught. Stocks began making mistakes almost immediately. He gave inconsistent accounts to witnesses, which was noticed. Also, he soon stood to one side rolling a cigarette and looking on his phone, rather than, like a normal person, trying to help this injured child. Officers spoke to Stocks, and here is a short clip of that interaction.
I said, "Don't go near that cliff."
Yeah.
And he goes and then went, and It's just okay.
So
was he just walking?
No, he was running.
The police on scene began investigating, and the witnesses all pointed the finger at Anthony Stocks, not at that moment for pushing Adam, but due to him having been the responsible adult who'd apparently allowed a small child to walk to the edge of a cliff. Stocks was arrested on suspicion of neglect and allowing the serious injury of a child. At this point, Adam had been taken by air ambulance to St George's Hospital in London. He went into cardiac arrest at least once and had to be revived. He was then placed in a medically induced coma for several weeks. During his police interview, Stocks said that he'd been sitting on a bench and smoking a cigarette when Adam walked to the edge of the cliff, and then, in a moment, he'd slipped and fallen. The police knew Stocks was lying. He'd been seen standing near Adam before he fell. However, they didn't have enough to hold him, and he was released on bail. They knew he'd pushed Adam, but they didn't currently know why or have the evidence to prove it. The subsequent police investigation lasted over a year. They began looking into Stocks' background, interviewing those who knew him, including Adam's family. Eventually, the police were able to gain Laura's trust. She told them everything: the years of rape and abuse, and Stocks telling her that he was going to kill her brother. A mental health worker who regularly spoke to Stocks after the incident also called police. She later said in court, quote, "He talks about how he and the girl wanted to be together all the time, and that one day they would get married. He thought she was listening to him and understood him like no one else. He talked about how he needed to see her and how he missed her. He talked about her all the time. He never seemed interested in the boy, never mentioned him, which seemed odd since he was in the hospital at the time." On the 23rd of November 2023, over a year after his attempt to murder Adam, the police arrived at Anthony Stocks' flat to re-arrest him for some truly horrific offences.
Hi there, is that Anthony?
Tony, yeah.
Hi there, can we come in? Okay, so I'm going to be arresting you for a number of offences. I'm just going to explain what those offences are and then I'll caution you. So I'm arresting you on suspicion of attempted murder of rape or sexual assault by penetration of and child abduction, sexual assault by touching a girl under 16, touching of vagina, body and mouth, okay? And also causing a child to incite into a sexual act, which was causing to touch your penis.
Stocks was then taken in for questioning. At the start of his police interview, his solicitor read out a prepared statement on behalf of his client, which read, quote, "I'm not sexually attracted to children, and have not tried to have or instigated sexual activity with children." He then gave no comment responses to all questions, as shown by this short clip.
Did you want him to go over the cliff?
No comment.
What did you want to happen?
No comment.
Did you push him over the cliff?
No comment.
His silence didn't matter, and the next day, Anthony Stocks was charged with sexual assault of a child under 13, causing or inciting a child under 13 to engage in sexual activity, rape, and attempted murder. If found guilty, he would potentially be sent to prison for the rest of his life. Anthony Stocks pleaded not guilty to all charges, and his trial began at Oxford Crown Court in May 2024. Unbelievably, despite how serious the offences were, Stocks was not remanded and was on bail, with him being photographed outside the court. Eventually, he was held in prison, but this was apparently only because he could not afford to travel to Oxford, and so he was remanded to ensure his attendance at the trial. I find this really astounding. This was a man who had raped a child for years and had tried to kill another, who was potentially looking at spending decades in prison. He had nothing left to lose. I think it's perfectly conceivable that he could have gone on a campaign of rape against children, and or gone after Laura again. What really was there to stop him? The reason why he was allowed to stay in the world appears to have been, based on news reports, because Anthony Stocks was considered a vulnerable adult, a man who would likely be bullied and victimised in prison. Ridiculous, isn't it? During the trial, both Adam and Laura bravely gave evidence. There was also a raft of witnesses who'd been on the cliffs that day. Anthony Stocks gave evidence and claimed that he'd lost sight of Adam after repeatedly warning him not to climb the safety fence, and that he'd ignored this before slipping and falling. As to why he'd taken him to those cliffs in the first place, Stocks stated that he was a movie fan and had wanted to see the cliffs shown in the British film Quadrophenia. Even this made no sense. Those cliffs were at Beachy Head, 20 miles away from where he was. However, it was his statements about the offences against Laura which show how disgusting a monster this man is. He claimed that he'd been the one who'd been sexually assaulted by Laura and not the other way around. He claimed that Laura, who I remind you was between 10 and 13 years old during the abuse, had touched his penis several times, quote, with her hands and mouth, and that he'd been forced to push her off whilst calling her a stupid little bitch. When asked whether he'd ever initiated sexual contact with Laura, he responded, no, never. It also came out in court that Stocks had made similar claims to others before his arrest. A social worker called Rebecca Valentine told jurors that during her very first conversation with Stocks, he'd spoken repeatedly about Laura and that he'd blamed her for the police investigation against him. She said, quote, it was the first time I met Mr. Stocks. He told me that police were investigating him on allegations of sexual abuse and that he was very worried about it. He said the girl and her sexualised behaviour targeted him and she referred to him as her boyfriend. Rebecca also stated that during her interaction with Stocks, he kept pointing to his penis whilst talking about Laura, which she found highly inappropriate, but which he seemed to have no issue with. On the 6th of June 2024, the jury found Anthony Stocks guilty of all charges. He was back in court on the 26th of July and stood before Judge Nigel Daly for sentencing. The hearing started with victim impact statements being read out. Heartbreakingly, part of Adam stated that he was too young to protect his sister and that, quote, someone else should have to do that. It continued, it made me grow up quicker. It was stressful. I felt angry at the time, and I feel angry now. I now know that he pushed me off the cliff. I can't find the right words to say how that makes me feel. This little boy, who was so brave, was still only around 12 years old when he had to give evidence in court. It was disclosed that Adam had 4 scars on his torso as a result of the fall, which would likely require further surgeries. He also suffered from daily muscular pain and had issues with his long-term memory. With regards to Laura, she was being supported by a psychologist, but it was stated that, while she was making good progress, she was a long way from being able to trust anyone, especially men. I'll now read out remarks made by the judge. I'll substitute the names of the children that I've chosen into what I'm saying to make it flow better. Also for context, the attached team is a part of Oxfordshire County Council, staffed by psychologists who work with children to overcome trauma linked to no longer living with their birth parents. So Judge Daly stated, quote, Mr. Stocks, you have heard the effects that the injuries have had on Adam, and he will continue to suffer throughout his life. But it is not just the physical injuries that will have to endure. He's been severely traumatised by what you did to him, made even worse because he thought he was being taken on a special treat to see football stadiums. He trusted you, and you betrayed that trust in an attempt to cover up your own deviant sexual behaviour towards Laura. I shall quote from the report from the attached team. We figured there is no word in the entire English language that can accurately describe the cruelty, the horror, the indecency, and the near-death experience that Adam was exposed to. Adam and Laura suffered from an appalling upbringing. Their determination and courage to give their account was humbling to witness. Both gave their evidence in a remarkably clear and mature way. I found them both very impressive, and they should be very proud of themselves. You have reached the age of 54 without committing other offences of a similar nature. You have significant disabilities of your own. However, your total failure to accept responsibility for what you've done, together with your ongoing obsession with a child, gives me grave concerns. Your inability to recognise what you've done leads me to believe that you are even more dangerous. You groomed and assaulted this vulnerable young girl for your own deviant sexual pleasure. It happened time and time again. It's clear from the evidence that you became utterly obsessed with her and would go to any level to stop anyone interfering with your abhorrent behaviour. You have ruined the lives of these 2 children. He then sentenced him for attempting to murder Adam when he was 10 years old and sexually abusing and raping Laura when she was between 10 and 13 years old. Anthony Stocks was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years, meaning he can apply for parole when he's in his early 70s. It needs to be pointed out here, as I'll come back to later, that Stocks' tariff would have been 29 years, but 10 years was taken off because of his extreme intellectual difficulties. I don't know Adam or Laura's real names, but I don't think I can make this video without highlighting their strength. Adam was just 10 years old, but he was determined to save his sister when no one else would, and Laura was brave enough to speak up, to break 3 years of manipulation by the monster that is Anthony Stocks. Both were so brave to give evidence in court, a terrifying prospect for anyone, let alone a child. The only positive is that both children were removed from their parents and placed with people who I have no doubt will care for them more than their so-called mother and father, and I hope they get the help to heal. Laura indicated that by the time of the court case, she was attending school, had friends, and was enjoying her life. I wish both of them nothing but peace and happiness for the rest of their lives. Anthony Stocks is an extremely dangerous man who has absolutely no issue with raping and killing children. I cannot comment on his upbringing as there's no information about this, so I'll predominantly focus on his crimes, which shows just how twisted he is. There are parallels between this case and that of Girl X, 9-year-old Shatoya Curry, who was raped and beaten in Chicago in 1997. In that video, I outlined how the perpetrator would try to argue in court that Shatoya had essentially molested him and not the other way around. With Stocks, he claimed the same thing happened with Laura. At just 10 years old, she was basically trying to grab his penis, and he seemed to think this would be believed. The explanation I gave in the Girl X video, which applies in this case, is that most people who offend against children know that what they're doing is wrong, disgusting, and completely rejected by society, but they come up with thoughts which enable them to justify their behaviour. For example, saying to themselves that she didn't scream when I was abusing her, so she must have enjoyed it. But ultimately, when they get caught, all of that falls away. They often simply claim it didn't happen, because they know that any sexually motivated contact with a child, in any form, is abhorrent. But there are some people who are so depraved, so disconnected from societal norms, that they've convinced themselves that their disgusting sexual interest in children is perfectly normal. In fact, it's what everyone thinks, that even very young children are as preoccupied with sex as they are. These people will look you straight in the face or give evidence in court and say that their victim welcomed the abuse, and they genuinely think you'll believe them because they assume everyone else thinks the same way that they do. Right, so this 4-year-old girl kept asking you for sex. Yeah, that seems reasonable. Court was not the only time that Stocks did this. When he spoke to the social worker about Lucy, she noted that he constantly pointed at his penis and seemed to have no awareness about how inappropriate this was when talking about a 13-year-old child. Anthony Stocks was aware there were laws against sexual acts with children, but he knew this only as a concept. These existed, but he didn't agree with them or understand why they were in place. He knew because of them he had to be careful and conceal his offending, but as far as he was concerned, he wanted to have sex with children, and they, in his sick mind, were up for anything. What was the problem? Stocks targeted a little girl who was desperate for love and attention, and used her vulnerabilities to manipulate her into meeting his sexual needs. He used terms like "I love you" to facilitate his disgusting sexual acts, over and over again. However, there's more to this, which again shows how distorted Anthony Stocks' thinking is. I believe that rather than seeing himself as a man who was raping and abusing a little girl, as the years went on, he began to see her as a friend, or even a girlfriend. He was clearly a lonely, isolated man, and I imagine that Laura became the person he would go to with his problems. He would likely abuse her, and then moan about his issues and being lonely, expecting his victim to comfort him. Due to how traumatised she was, because of her home life and the repeated molestation, Laura likely complied, listening to his ramblings, responded with sympathy. She didn't really have a choice. This led Stocks to start to believe that perhaps one day they could get married. It's important to dispel any notion that this is what we traditionally think of as marriage, as a union between two people. Anthony Stocks wanted a way to have ultimate control over Laura. By marrying her, he would have someone he could have sex with and go to with his problems 24/7. Someone just for him. This had nothing to do with consideration for her. This was all about him, his needs, his wants. However, because of his distorted thinking, Stocks convinced himself that this was also what Laura wanted, to serve him. Stocks' complete self-centeredness is integral to understanding why he tried to kill Adam. Adam got in the way of him getting sexual gratification and was ruining his plan to continue to use Laura for the foreseeable future, not just sexually, but emotionally as well. To him, Adam trying to intervene was not a boy trying to save his sister from being molested. It was like an annoying friend constantly tagging along when you're trying to spend time with your girlfriend. It was this, rather than any fear of getting caught, which motivated Stocks, because in his mind, he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. Adam was not a little boy, he was a problem that needed to be dealt with. And so Stocks decided to kill him, to remove him from the picture so Laura would be his. Again, he knew that murder was wrong in theory, and there were laws against this, so he needed to be careful, but he saw no issue with doing this, as long as it meant he got what he wanted. Stocks told Laura his plan. I think he genuinely believed that she would be ecstatic. Awesome, Tony. With my brother out of the way, I can continue to have sex with you and listen to your problems forever. That's all I want, because it's all you want. And so he pushed his 10-year-old boy off a cliff, believing that with Adam dead, the problem would go away. He had no remorse for his actions. His only regret was that he didn't succeed. I have no doubt that to this day, Anthony Stocks is struggling to understand what he's done wrong. He was having sex with a child, which is totally fine, when he tried to kill another one, as they were getting in the way of what he wanted to do. Surely everyone would have done the same in his position. One thing that really annoys me about this case is how, because Anthony Stocks was assessed as having a low IQ, he automatically got years off of his sentence. Unfortunately, having intellectual difficulties is a standard mitigating factor, and so all offenders, no matter how serious the offence, will usually get credit for this. It's up to the judge how much. 10 years, I think, in this case was utterly ridiculous, but I really think he should have got nothing. The issue I have is that IQ is such a poor measure of intelligence, although it's so frequently used in so many settings. This isn't just me saying it, it's been argued by many professionals to be an utterly useless measure of true intellectual functioning. IQ is simply a measure of how a person performs on a narrow set of questions compared to other people, and these include questions about which number comes next in a sequence, or if Mary is twice as old as Ian, etc, etc. These tests give little real insight into what people could achieve and accomplish, and importantly, what they're capable of, which in the case of criminal cases are things like planning and ability to manipulate. In the case of Anthony Stocks, I imagine he couldn't spell to save his life, or work out what number comes next, but he was clearly able to identify a broken home and exploit this to the fullest, as well as manipulating and grooming one of the children for his own sexual gratification. He was also able to plan a murder, picking a method which potentially would be ruled an accident, as well as researching and travelling to locations to commit his crimes. His plan was not overly sophisticated, but it clearly showed evidence of pre-planning and thought, and this is the issue. Some people I've interviewed, who on paper have got very low IQs, have been some of the most devious and manipulative people I've come across. Added to this, despite his low IQ, the judge himself stated that Stocks knew that abusing children and murder were wrong. Personally, I think that taking time off automatically, solely because someone has a low IQ, or allowing them to stay in the community when everyone else would have been remanded without considering other factors, is a mistake, and can mean that people like Anthony Stocks may offend whilst awaiting court proceedings or be released long before they should. Whether he's ever released is unclear. As I said earlier, Stocks will not be able to apply for parole until he's in his early 70s, and he's so sick and twisted, I doubt he'll ever admit to having done anything wrong. However, I don't think it can be discounted that his new friends in prison won't take the law into their own hands, given how truly disgusting this man is. So what's your thoughts on this case? If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button. You can also send a one-off donation to support the channel using the thanks button. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.